Excellent, everyone. Looks like we've got our attendees, and thank you for joining today. My name is Greg Crabb, and I am CISO in residence here at Ballistic Ventures. We've got a great panel on tap today for our next installment of the Shift Now webinar series. It's a monthly series featuring our portfolio companies. Today's panel is hosted by Oligo, who's redefining runtime security. I'm going to introduce you to Noah Simon, who is head of product marketing at Oligo. He'll moderate today's session. And Oligo transforms the way security teams secure applications, evolving from point-in-time static practices to real-time defenses. The Oligo platform monitors how each application component behaves, detects anomalies, and prevents malicious activity for known and unknown attacks. If you have any questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A function, and Noah and I will make sure that we flag the questions. But now I'd like to turn it over to Noah to lead the session and introduce our guests. The floor is yours, Noah.
Thanks so much, Greg. And thanks everyone for dialing in today. Really looking forward to today's discussion. We have two of what I consider today's experts in application security. So I'm happy to be joined by Kunal Bhattacharya, who's VP of Security Engineering at Tekion, and he's held lots of AppSec and cloud security and security engineering roles at a lot of software and fintech companies. I'm sure you can find him on LinkedIn and see where he's worked. But welcome, Kunal, and thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Noah.
And we also have Dan Klopfer, who's a product management director of software supply chain security at Salesforce. He's also been an InfoSec engineer and product manager, working for state and local gov, healthcare, and of course now software. So Dan, thanks for joining us today too.
Thanks, Noah. It's good to be here.
Great. So we're going to spend most of our time discussing the concept of application detection and response with Dan and Kunal today. But I also want to briefly touch on the state of AppSec, which I think should provide a lot of context for today's discussion. I'll also spend just a brief amount of time defining what is application detection response. This is a whole new concept and term that we're learning many are still unfamiliar with, because it's a whole new thing that's kind of just happening right now. And of course,
Simon, I apologize, Simon. We've got a couple of folks that are saying they cannot hear the audio. Can I get some participants to give yes, I can hear, or no, I can't hear in the chat so we know? Okay, we're getting yes, I can hears. So
okay.
Thank you for all confirming. We'll continue on. Thanks. Apologize, Noah. Back to you.
No problem. I appreciate you confirming that we're coming through. I don't want to talk to a blank wall that cannot hear me. So yeah, we'll briefly discuss what ADR is, and like I said, we'll spend the bulk of today's discussion getting Dan and Kunal's thoughts. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and the Q&A, and we'll try and get to them as much as we can. So I want to start with some context for today's discussion, and first, just by appreciating the massive challenge that Kunal and Dan have, and that all of you in the security space have. This first image on the left is showing the rise of vulnerability exploitation. And this is actually just dropped this morning. It's the newest Verizon data breach investigation report. But what stands out to me is that vulnerability exploitation has surpassed phishing in terms of being an initial access vector in data breaches. I've been in this industry for a decade now, and phishing was always the thing that you heard of, oh, how did this breach start? Someone got phished. This has started to flip itself, and the rise of vulnerability exploitation is certainly a huge challenge. And then I want to just quickly focus on the image of the right, because if all these vulnerabilities are being exploited, how do we find signals and patterns in which ones that are being used most common? So looking at this chart, which is a little bit small, but it's showing a lot of the common CWEs that are associated with known exploited vulnerabilities. And so here I found a few interesting things. There's a lot of risks like path traversal and out of bounds write and SQL injection, which I think have been on people's radars for many years now. But then we also have code injection and command injection. And you see here as a basis on percentage, most of these types of risks are being exploited on a pretty high percentage basis. Per vulnerability that's being issued for these types of things. So I just want to pause here and Kunal, Daniel, any thoughts on not necessarily these statistics in particular, but what you're seeing on a daily basis in the challenges you face?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Noah. So from my perspective, I guess I'm surprised as well to see the phishing getting down. Although it's not really going down, the techniques for phishing are actually becoming more and more sophisticated, especially with deepfakes and AI in general. But going back to the vulnerabilities, right? One of the biggest challenges that an AppSec engineer or AppSec leader has to deal with is with the context of the vulnerabilities, right? So you may find a vulnerability, you may find a vulnerability which is not exploitable, or it may be exploitable. So it's always a challenge to look at an issue and see what the context is and whether you can give it a pass or you want to be, fixing it. And how do you fix it? Of course, that's a much bigger question in itself.
Absolutely.
I'd say from my side of things, no, it's not really surprising that the exploitation of vulnerabilities is increasing. A lot of the times you look at attacks, you look at how to get the information. It's the lowest common denominator. It's what tends to be the easiest to get the largest impact. On top of that, it's also a question of what do you measure and how do you measure it. So in the recent years, vulnerabilities has kind of taken a more of a center stage, as kind of phishing has been kind of just existing for a while. So we're getting better scanners, we're getting more details, which is going to produce a better metric and a better understanding of what the actual attack sides are going.
Yeah, it's a great point. In a way, this wasn't surprising that I saw this morning, right? Because we saw, especially in the last kind of 2-3 years, the number of CVEs just kind of explode, and especially with things like open source. So it wasn't surprising, but I guess maybe I've been in this game a little bit too long that still it was jarring to me that it surprised phishing. So pretty, it really sheds light on the importance of strong AppSec programs, of course. So with that discussion out of the way, I want to shift into application detection response. And this is a whole new concept. You're not going to find a kind of Gartner Magic Quadrant on it. But a lot of analysts, a lot of practitioners are beginning to write and explore this concept. Now, before I define ADR and talk about what the capabilities and how it differs from other approaches, I do want to raise a poll. So we're going to raise a quick poll right now. I really want to understand what describes your approach in protecting applications today. So we should have a poll going up here any second. Great. Hopefully you're all seeing it now. So what best describes your approach in protecting applications today? One approach could be that you rely principally on finding and fixing issues early in the SDLC with things like SCA, SAST, or other type of application security testing tools. Another possibility is maybe you're relying on some runtime approaches like WAF or API security or workload protection. And then the final option here, or the next to final option here, is the kind of a balanced approach of a mix between vulnerability management and runtime security solutions. And then there's some other approach. If we see any responses for this, I would love to see what other approaches are possible here. We'll leave this poll live for just another 20, 30 seconds or so. Cool. All right, this is interesting. 57% saying they use a mix of vulnerability management, runtime security solutions. That doesn't surprise me. I was expecting this to be the most common response, but a pretty sizable amount saying that they rely um, on application security testing early in the SDLC, 36%. I figured it was going to be between those two. Interesting to see 7% on relying on runtime only. Two responses there. Interesting. Okay, we'll come back to this soon. Now, I want to talk about application detection and response, and I think it's important to consider history really quickly to explain how we see this concept evolving and arising. If we look at endpoint detection as one example here, you had antivirus, which was obviously a very important technology that came out, and then kind of in the kind of early 2010s or so, EDR really hit the stage and provided kind of behavioral-based detection for devices, and this really became so powerful of a technology and something that was so needed that it basically absorbed antivirus, right? So there was the Symantec and then kind of the CrowdStrike, which, which kind of evolved out of that. And now EDR is obviously a very integral solution in most security stacks, and it's still a big market. You see the same kind of thing in network security. So you had kind of your first generation firewalls, and then deep packet inspection kind of came, and it was a more effective way to find malicious traffic, and this kind of absorbed your kind of V1 or first generation firewalls. So this is a common pattern, not just in security, but in all of technology. This is where we really see ADR going is application detection and response is a new technology that's running, that's delivering protection for your running code in an application in addition to your workload here. So it's really building upon workload protection, or CWPP, if you're aware of that acronym, which is Cloud Workload Protection Platform. And it's adding additional telemetry. So you have the telemetry on the workload, similar to what CWPP provides, plus new telemetry at the application layer. And ADR is really correlating these two things to provide a more comprehensive view into attacks and exploits. So ADR is really this new evolution. And it's offering a more modern, resilient solution that you can deploy against for real-time detection and prevention at the app layer. So a fundamental capability of ADR that we need to really define here is profiling. So profiling is kind of akin to that EDR, behavioral-based detection, where profiling looks at things like libraries across different languages and understands how they're intended to behave. And then once we have that understanding, we can detect deviations against that. The reason this is important is because this is offering robust detection beyond just signature-based things like CVE identifiers and known risks. So profiling is what's enabling a lot of detection for these exploits, even if it's something that hasn't been seen before, but the library is known. And this is really important because, especially with open source, a lot of these CVEs that are critical are dropped on a Friday, and all of a sudden it's for some package or some library that, almost everyone uses and no one really thought about. So this is a really important component of ADR. When we talk about deployments, there's different approaches out there. A very common one is using eBPF. Which I don't want to get into all of the details today, but eBPF has become a very common tool And leading solutions out there, we think, will have a very lightweight eBPF sensor that basically doesn't introduce any impact to the actual running application. So just quickly, when you think about other runtime approaches, I think 2 respondents or 7% of the respondents say that we rely on runtime approaches. I'm assuming it's some kind of combination of these tools. And so if we kind of look at what's been quote unquote runtime, in terms of that definition, a lot of that is WAF and API security at the network. And these are important protections to have. They've been around for a while, but what we've seen is attackers have found a lot of ways to bypass network-based protections with things like payload obfuscation or just mimicking legitimate traffic. Now, of course, you also have EDR or CWPP, some kind of protection on the actual workload or host. And again, very important to have this kind of layered protection, but these solutions are looking at basically the OS and looking at malicious behavior on the OS layer, not at the application layer. A very similar approach to ADR is something called RASP, or Runtime Application Self-Protection. These are very, very similar in that RASP will provide application visibility, but it's instrumented, right? So it's actual code that's instrumented within your app, and we've seen that this approach has become quite tricky to scale, and also introduces a lot of performance risks in the way that it's deployed. If the RASP fails, your app basically can go down. So this is what we've seen in terms of just the limitations of other approaches for ADR. So final thing here on ADR is what can it actually do for you? First, because it has that app layer visibility and the workload layer visibility, it can detect initial exploits. So things like code injection, things like SQL injection, and other types of initial access vectors, and the post-exploit activity on the workload. So things similar to what a cloud workload protection solution might provide. Typically, this is, again, delivered with a eBPF type sensor, which has telemetry into your application, into network traffic, file management, and process type telemetry on the workload. And again, this is not an approach that requires code instrumentation in the way that RASP would, and it actually doesn't even require access to source code. So it's not looking at version control systems or your CI/CD pipelines necessarily. It's just looking at the running code on your app in runtime. Okay, so that was quite a lot of definition, but hopefully it provides context for those of you who are unfamiliar with ADR, or application detection and response. I want to pivot now to the main discussion here with Kunal and Daniel. And my first question here is really around, the rate of new vulnerabilities. We talked about this at the introduction. The rate of new vulnerabilities is just skyrocketing each year, and we just saw the new trend of vulnerability exploitation. So my question is that, do you feel detection and response has been kind of neglected as something that's not really possible, or as kind of a last resort in application security in change for, vulnerability prioritization and remediation? So I guess to sum it up, is vulnerability prioritization sufficient alone, or do you think detection and response is valuable for AppSec? So Dan, Kunal, curious to get your thoughts here.
So from my perspective, it really depends upon where you are as an organization in your maturity curve. For example, let's say you have an organization who is very new in their security journey, which is something that happens, whether we like it or not. And they have the application built out, and they're just affirming, the security best practices. First thing you want to be doing is, identify what your crown jewels are and protect them. We always talk about shift left in security. If you find any issue during the design phase, that's the cheapest thing to do. And then you go along with the SDLC. That's the ideal way to do things. But when you're in an organization where you already have the application built out, maybe legacy code and things like that. You need to protect what is out there while you install the best practices as an organization. In such a case, you definitely need to have the detection response because you may be vulnerable out there. You just don't know it. It's just a matter of, one bad actor finding something and, basically bringing you down entirely. I mean, it can be as catastrophic as that. So, you definitely need to find some of those issues, and there are different ways towards doing it. But essentially, at the runtime level, the idea here is to be able to find those issues, find the endemic issues at an organization level, and then gradually build your practice towards finding them earlier in the cycle. So, long answer, but basically, you want to be going from detection and response towards more of a holistic vuln management approach where you go from little or limited maturity towards a little bit more maturity.
Yeah,
think I
Dan,
agree.
any thoughts on?
Sorry, no, I actually think so I agree with Kunal in some respects to the points that you're making. So, I think the way I kind of see this is the vulnerability management. There are, yeah, a second, I got to think about how I want to phrase this. The number of vulnerabilities that are coming up that are being detected over the course of last year, this year, the projected future, right? It's just going to get worse, effectively. The only way to really solve that is, I would say, from a traditional standpoint, is prioritization, right? Focus on the important things that need to be fixed first, right? With the assumption that you're going to get the fix out very quickly. Right. And so that exposure window is fairly slow. And what happens is organizations that tend to focus on that tend to make the assumption that they can get the fix out before a bad actor can exploit the hole. Moving to more of a detection response kind of is something where people kind of go in and say, hey, this is the way that we can go ahead and protect our crown jewels. We have a way to know when there's something that's going to happen and have a form of responding to that. Getting a more robust system in place, it gives you more time to actually go ahead and remediate the vulnerabilities that you're finding. So I feel it's one of those, one fixes the other, but they're both kind of in this cycle where it's, as you improve over duration, it gets better, it gets easier, it gets faster.
Yeah, I love both of those perspectives. Very interesting, Kunal, that you think, almost starting with detection response allows you to build best practice and capability on the vulnerability management side. I think that's a very interesting perspective that we don't often hear. And Dan, I love what you say about actually buying time to fix the exposure. That's definitely a way we are starting to think about. One of the possibilities of ADR is detecting something. If it's a known CVE, you're gonna have to buy time to fix that CVE. But if it's already been detected, you have to first focus on minimizing impact and responding as quickly as possible. So yeah, very, very interesting perspectives. I want to dive a little bit deeper and talk about the differences in shift left versus runtime and where should tools kind of incorporate, sorry, not tools, where should teams consider incorporating these approaches into their overall strategy? So it's a little bit similar to the last question, but in regards to shift left as a mindset and not just, vulnerability management or kind of application security tools.
So again, I guess pivoting from the last question itself, right? The reason I say that depends upon the organization maturity of the organization is because with runtime, you get issues that are out there that are exploitable, which you need to immediately remediate depending upon the severity of the issue. Um, you do shift left, which is definitely the best practice. Um, you have to weed through the chaff in order to find that unique aha thing wherein, hey, this is exploitable and this is something that's going to bring the system down. So I would pivot it to say it's not necessarily versus runtime. I would say both. Eventually, you want both because again, in security, we talk about multiple layers of defense. So you want to be doing both. Um, Time and place, that depends on where you are, and basically that's how I look at it. And in a way, I know shift left has been overtly used. The way I like to say it is um, shift right to shift left. What I mean by that is once you identify um, what is out there, what is your threat landscape in terms of at the application level. For example, you may have your application riddled with a lot of injection vulnerabilities. So you find that using, let's say, a bug bounty program, or you run some tools at the far right, um, then you know that you have an endemic problem around injection. You need to educate your developers. You need to build in those controls, which will fix it for the injection. I'm not saying that RCs and some of the other stuff that is out there is not important, but you need to look at what's the biggest challenge that you have as an organization, and then of course start seeing if you can find it earlier in the life cycle. If you're finding it in production, you want to be finding it during testing. If you're finding it during testing, you want to be finding it during code, and you keep shifting left.
I definitely see the differences between them and having them both in a software lifecycle. I kind of look at shift left as running and making sure you're taking care of all of the broad strokes of the holes, where it's I guess I put the analogy as building a boat, right? You're building the hull of the boat, you're making sure that you're covering all the big holes and making sure that everything's sorted through your various different techs, and then you're testing this out by putting it into runtime and having it scan, right? And since a lot of the attacks, a lot of the issues come through runtime analysis, pulling that back into your shift left your method, right, and being able to fix that code going forward helps strengthen how you build out your services, over the long pull. So it's definitely good to have both of them. I think limitations as far as what shift left and runtime have between them is a lot of Kunal, to your point, like the overuse of the shift left terminology. Like there's a lot of tech this day and age where they're saying, hey, we're going to put this in front of developers, right? And so you get to the point where you just get blinded by the noise to signal ratio, and you don't know what you need to fix first in order to go ahead and make things better immediately. So I definitely believe that the runtime analysis helps with with being able to give developers a focus on what they need to take a look at when they start, after they've stood up their services and they've got them running for a bit.
Yeah,
Sorry,
go
just to
ahead.
clarify,
Sorry.
when I say shift right, I may be sounding like I'm advocating more towards right, but just want to clarify that a shift left is the ultimate goal, because if you find an issue during the design phase, you have the opportunity to fix it before a single line of code is written. So that definitely brings down the cost as well as the implications. So just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, these are good perspectives. And it's definitely not a verse. It's a symbiotic relationship. I think everyone agrees on that. And I really do like the aspect of using runtime signals as a way um, to gain insight into recurring patterns and trends that can inform security awareness and education. And Dan kind of alluded to this, like a lot of the searching early in the SDLC can find tons of issues, but it's often tricky to understand which of those issues are actually relevant in the running app versus just a code repo that's isolated. So using the runtime signals for education is actually a really interesting way to think about this. So we've defined what ADR is, and we've spoken about kind of left side versus right side. I'm curious, what kind of detection use cases do you think are uniquely fit for ADR versus other kind of AppSec tools or other kind of runtime tools? Kunal, Dan, any thoughts on this?
from my perspective, right, what I've seen over the last decade or so happening is we always had CVEs, right, at the infrastructure layer, millions of them in some cases, and it may sound it may overwhelm you to say that, oh, there's like a million vulnerabilities out there, but it's usually all you need to do to fix it is basically patch it. And it sounds easy enough. Of course, it's not that easy. Um, but when you compare that with the CWEs, you really need to figure out what the impact is, what the priority is, and how it will impact underlying code. Because at the end of the day, you're not just patching it, but you're changing something in the code to doing it. So, but over time, what I've seen happen is a lot of reliability on third-party code. And I think I've given some talk around custom code and third-party code libraries. Around 70% is the third-party code. And what we have seen happening because of that is the same problem that was percolated in the CVE world, kind of flowing to the application security world. Log4j was, of course, the best use case that I've seen. um, a particular version was vulnerable, and a particular version and above was vulnerable. And while it was evolving, it was kind of like a movie scenario where we were building these charts out saying that, hey, if you have this vulnerability, you do this. If you have this version, do this. So I think from a detection use cases, the biggest bang for the buck for ADR, in my opinion, would be if you're able to find out those third party um, vulnerabilities or functions in those third party libraries, which are actually utilized in your custom code, um, and you're able to reach those functions so that it becomes exploitable. There might be situations where there are vulnerable functions in the libraries that are being called um, by the custom code, but maybe those particular functions are not really uh, utilized in the code itself, in the application path. Um, those are things that you can afford to ignore, at least in the short run. And this is where kind of being very picky about prioritization really helps, which I think is the biggest use case that I see today for ADR.
So I think on my side of things, when I look at this, when I look at the detection, the use cases for ADR as far as it goes for detection versus AppSec and other tools, right? When we take a look at WAFs, when we take a look at even the boundary tools that we see, these are eventually what the signals that we get are, these would be indicators of compromise, right? It's the, hey, something got past the network firewall and it's done something and we don't know what's going on. Right. ADR gives us a little bit more visibility to be able to say, hey, now we can actually go ahead and start tracking some of this. You know, we can find out where this is, and because it's in the runtime, getting this information to your SOC team or to the detection and response team so that they can triage this. This functions more as a real-time sensor versus kind of the I want to say more, I hate to say tried and true, but more of the regular sense of, hey, you're scoping for you're poking around for log files, you're trying to correlate data, you're trying to see what's going on with from a lot of different data sources, and that all takes time, right? And that's where we see in the reportings for of incidents, you know, hey, we see a compromise that had happened and it existed for 200 days, and then we see the remediation takes 69 days, right? It takes a while for traditional systems to go ahead and actually find something that's of interest to go ahead and be looked at. With AI automation, we'll see better of that, but the faster we can get to a signal that we can react to, the better.
Yep. These are both great perspectives. Kunal, I like how you emphasized something we didn't really talk about, which is kind of even more telemetry on the vulnerability management side, knowing whether you're running the particular vulnerable function that's actually making a vulnerability exploitable, or whether you're not running it is one way to to save a lot of headache and unneeded developer hours, like looking into remediating or upgrading a certain package. And yeah, Dan, your thoughts on just again buying more time is really where we see some value in customers looking at ADR. I do want to pause because there's a couple of questions that came through, and we'll continue the discussion. Someone asked how these sensors are different from CNAP sensors out there in the market. Tools like Wiz use eBPF. So I don't want to go into all the details on this, but basically eBPF allows you to see kernel level activity. There's a huge variance in what might be available in terms of how that eBPF is applied from one company to the next. So that's where confusion comes in. Everyone's saying they have an eBPF sensor of some sort, which is great, but it's really how that eBPF is applied. I can go into how Oligo applies it at another time, but I want to focus today's discussion more on just the concept of ADR. We have another question here around runtime exploitation. Could see ADR being valuable in a hybrid high trust environment. I guess this question is saying I often don't see remote code execution. My current environment is a combination of Kubernetes and legacy monolithic apps. So maybe there's no question there, but interesting comment just around the tech landscape in healthcare there. Cool. Continuing on. Where does ADR fit into an overall strategy? I think, Kunal, Dan, you've alluded to this a little bit. I think we all agree and have discussed like a balanced approach between left side and runtime type tools. Absolutely is an ideal scenario. But beyond that, where do you see ADR either complementing certain tools or perhaps replacing them? Where do you see it fitting into a strategy?
From my perspective, it's interesting. The ADR, I foresee this going in the path of the EDR world, right? Like there are, I think, 2 or 3 big companies, or maybe 5, let's say at the most, big companies who are kings in the EDR space, and now the term has become XDR, and most of them are actually public companies. I don't really see any cybersecurity vendor in the ADR space or public companies, which is an interesting thing to observe. But I think overall, what's happening is there is an appetite towards developing faster and faster, and ideally, we want to be, doing the threat modeling. We want to be running the tools far left, and then doing the due diligence during each phase of SDLC. But you do want that umbrella protection at the end to make sure that you have it at the end to be able to block any attack that's happening at the application layer, similar to what you want to be doing at the OS layer as well, right? So that's where I see ADR fitting in. And in an ideal world, I don't know how long from here, like 2 years, 1 year, I don't know. But it could be that all of this telemetry is going to flow in, and you would be able to marry the information that you're gathering from the EDR tools out there, and of course the XDR as well, and then feeding it back, because at the end of the day, an exploitability can come from both layers, whether it's application layer or OS layer, it doesn't really matter. And it's all about chaining together the attacks. So I see that kind of fitting into the whole ecosystem, the right side to begin with, and then getting great insights to be able to, faster development, secure development is how I'd like to put it.
So I do see it as kind of the same form, how EDR helped inform about the surface area and the threat terrain of this an ecosystem. ADR is going to do the same thing at the application layer, and I feel like it's it's something that's prevalent where we're going to be able where that information can be fed back to the to developers to help make better coding choices. You know, whether or not using a vulnerable function or whether to go ahead and choose to not use a specific dependency because of the amount of vulnerabilities and the amount of detections that they're seeing for it, right? And so I feel like the ADR, it's going to start extending the cybersecurity strategy overall for companies, in a sense of we're going to start being able to see a lot more of where the touch point is between bad actors or the code base.
Awesome. We had another good question come in just about reachability. And it's kind of oligo specific, but it's asking, are there any numbers, statistics regarding oligo's ability to reduce noise? And I actually think this is kind of a good question just regarding the concept of reachability, because it's become a popular term. I'll just say from oligo's perspective, we use the term exploitability because what we see is actual dependencies either loaded into memory or actually executed. And because we can see deterministically if something's executed, it's not really about reachability, which is kind of a probabilistic analysis. It's more, hey, this is actually executed. It's running, and we know that the actual vulnerable function's running, therefore it's exploitable. So we do see a huge order of magnitude in the ability to reduce noise with this approach. Statistics I don't have offhand, but I just wanted to explain this concept because I know reachability has become a common term in the industry. It's not the way we think about it with runtime and application detection response, looking at things actually as they're running in the actual code running in the app in real time. So again, we think of that in terms of exploitability. Keep the questions coming. We do have time for a few more. I want to get into our last discussion question with Kunal and Dan. I think you alluded a little bit on how you both see ADR kind of following in the footsteps of EDR in terms of gaining a lot of traction and kind of evolving to detect across workload and application layer for broader detection. But beyond that, where do you see ADR going in kind of the next 3 to 5 years? Curious if you have any other thoughts.
I think kind of pivoting from the last question that I mentioned around going the same path as EDR, XDR, but basically marrying the two, right? So if you look at the big EDR, XDR players out there today, they are trying to, by the means of acquisition or in-house development, they're trying to go to the application space. And the reason why they're doing that is basically to be able to get all the telemetry which can be correlated. Of course, the processing power of computers have gone way up. And with quantum computing, that's going to go even up further, which means, at least theoretically, that you would be able to correlate a lot of these XDR and EDR data together to determine possible attack scenarios, more like how a red team does it, right? You do a reconnaissance, you figure out the weak link in the chain, and then attack that, right? So if you are taking that concept and applying, let's say you have an organization which has both products, EDR, XDR, at certain level of maturity, what you would need to do is basically correlate the two, put it in a data lake, apply AI, which is of course again a buzzword, but in reality, to get some of those relations going, to be able to say that, hey, this is the weakest link in the chain right now. This would be the first thing to fix, or at least the first few things that you can fix, compared to these other things which may not be that exploitable in the long run. This is where I see it evolving. Maybe not even 3 to 5 years, maybe even earlier.
Sorry, just thinking about my side of things. Honestly, I think this is going to be a significant tool when it comes to like leveraging artificial intelligence to go ahead and provide patching, provide some of the, what is it, the term nowadays, vibe coding, where you're using AI generated code to go ahead and help developers build out more safe, secure codes. But this is kind of where I see this is being deployed in the environment and pulling back and saying, hey, we know where we're vulnerable. We know what the vulnerable functionality, the functions are being leveraged. Take that information back and be able to provide developers and the set and saying, hey, instead of this, use this instead. Like give that guidance as far as open source dependencies and what function calls can be used, so that Kunal, to your point, right, shifting left, the right things, right? You get to a point where the vulnerabilities are never actually part of the code path to begin with, right? And base that off of real-time information that's being gathered in the environment.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think you both kind of pointed out two accelerators that stood out to me, kind of one on the threat side and one on the kind of defender side, if you will. Kunal, you pointed out quantum computing being able to correlate data for threat investigation and response in a way that we can't even almost imagine today. I'm looking forward to that. And then Dan, you alluded to vibe coding. We actually put out a blog on vibe coding, but this whole notion of just AI generated code, which by the way, a ton of AI generated code is leveraging open source. So there's kind of domino effects to this, but on the threat side of things, that's definitely going to just introduce greater volumes, right, of alerts and issues as we see it. So very interesting to kind of think of these accelerators both on the threat and defense side, and see how ADR might be affected by each of these. That is the last discussion point for now. Dan, Kunal, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. I learned a lot. I really value how you see ADR in terms of the whole kind of security strategies that you implement and work on a daily basis. Greg, wanted to turn it back to you, see if you had any final questions or thoughts on your end. And if not, we can conclude.
This was awesome, Noah and Daniel and Kanal. Thank you so much for your insights. And, as I reflect back on the types of application security incidents I've had over the years, this type of capability from an optics on actual runtime is invaluable. And one question I have is, how does this capability sit within your security operations team or your AppSec team? And are there any workflow differences that we need to consider to be able to provide this type of real-time response to application security alerts or issues?
Really good question. I can start with my thoughts because we're thinking about this every day at Oligo. So ADR, it's important if it's real-time detection and response. It's important that data can be sent to a SIM. So obviously that's a possibility. But then when it comes to workflow, like you asked about, Greg, with the exception of maybe like WAF detections, a lot of application-centric threats aren't necessarily like bread and butter for a lot of SOC analysts. Like they're not going to necessarily know if a certain library performs an action it's not supposed to. They're not going to they're not necessarily experts in Java and Python libraries. And by the way, not all developers are experts in all these libraries because there's too many of them for any one person to be an expert in everything. So this really is going to, I think, force a lot of even closer collaboration between SOC and AppSec teams and developers, maybe ultimately. But definitely SOC and AppSec teams who can react in real time and understand the implications of, hey, this library just called out to the network and it's usually used to just deserialize data. An AppSec person might understand that, but they're going to have to work with the SOC team to understand, okay, here's what we should do in terms of response here are, the best course of action as I see it. That's my point of view, but Kunal, Dan, would love to get your thoughts because, you guys are living this every day. These are just my observations from afar.
So from my perspective, it's a very interesting question, Greg, that you bring up. This is actually being a AppSec practitioner. It's been one of my pet peeves for a long time around security operations. And if you compare that with product security incident response, right, the PCERT as we like to call it, most organizations that I've had the opportunity to work with or for, they have dedicated SOC teams 24/7, but very few of them actually have PCERT. We are entering an era, especially with ADR coming into play, and if a lot more organizations adopt the strategy of looking at the application layer and stopping the threat at the end while you're building out the best practices towards the left. What I see happening is the PCERT actually merging with SOC more efficiently. So, for example, today in the SOC world, you need different skill sets, right? You need this level 1, level 2 analysts, and I see that. I mean, at the end, it may be SOC called SOC itself, but it's quite possible that you may need dedicated AppSec personnel to be able to triage those incidents. Because what I've seen happening in organizations is, let's say, and Log4j was actually a good example, right? Like, you needed application experts, application security experts to be able to determine what is a potential issue versus what's not. But if you imagine you have a scenario where you have at least a minimum of one AppSec expert in the SOC team, then you have all the bases covered. And this is where I see it evolving, Greg, especially if ADR takes off.
Yeah, excellent responses. And, as I reflect on some serious incidents that I've been involved in over the years, whether it's Log4j or going back to Apache Struts, the vulnerability that had hit Equifax. This is more than just a nice to have. This is mission critical. I think we as a body of practice really need to get to this type of ADR capabilities. So outstanding panel and really thank everyone and thank the participants on the line that have asked some really good questions. And I want to thank everyone and stay tuned for the next Shift Now, hosted by our Ballistic Ventures portfolio companies. If you have any questions in the interim, please reach out to myself or the portfolio companies or my dear friend David Hahn. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.